to believe that this is the last session of Resilience in the Face of COVID-19 with the really extraordinary Virginia O'Leary, known as Ginny to many of us. She is, of course, Professor Emeritus in Social Psychology, and it was her idea to not only to teach this class for OLLI, but to open it up to the entire community and make it accessible to everyone. And we want to give a big shout out and thank you to Pittsfield Community Television as well, because they are live streaming it on their educational channel. So thank you, PCTV. And then it's available on demand on their site as well as on our Facebook webpage. And they are also, I believe, sharing it with other community television networks in the Berkshires. So it's terrific to have it reach as many people as possible. And you will receive a link to the broadcast later, and we encourage you to share it with family and friends wherever they might be who might find it useful in these challenging times. And then I just want to remind everyone that this year's Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture will be held this Thursday, June 25th at 7 p.m. It will be online for the first time, and there is a link in the chat to register for that. It is free and open to all, and that can also be shared with friends and family wherever they are. And I think that David Frum is our lecturer this year. He has just released a new book called Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, and he'll be talking about how we can hopefully move forward from these challenging times. And he will be in conversation with Berkshire Eagle publisher Frederick Rutberg. So I encourage you to not miss that. It is at 7 p.m. this Thursday, and registration is free. And now it is my great pleasure to hand the mic over, so to speak, to Ginny O'Leary.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it does seem extraordinary that
This meeting is being recorded.
Week 4 in this 4-week course, and I want to thank you for participating. But even more on a personal level, and I know I've said this before, I want to thank you, all of you in the OLLI community and in the broader community in the Berkshires, for providing me with the opportunity to do an even deeper dive in the research literature that I am familiar with, in order to share with you both kind of the basis of what I know about resilience, as well as what I have learned in the last 4 weeks. So thanks. Well, this is not a good thing. My slides do not wish to. There we go. Technology is usually, but not always, our friend. So just a quick preview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to have a brief review of resilience. Then we're going to talk a bit about how we can learn to be resilient. We're going to talk about silver linings. I know sometimes when you're down, it's hard to think about the silver linings that this pandemic has provided. But I'm convinced that although we wouldn't have chosen it, we may be able to utilize this pause to make some changes that are very, very meaningful, both at the personal level as well as community level. As you can see, I'm an optimist. Whoops, we're going to look at a few takeaways from lockdown. Sometimes my fingers and my brain do not sync. We're going to look at some possible new models for doing things in a new way. So first, let's take a quick look at some things about resilience that we haven't had time to look at previously. One of those things, and I think that this is actually, no, drat, something's wrong. Well, okay. E.M.D.R, some of you, several years ago, might have heard Basil van der Kolk, can't say it today, speak about his book, The Body Keeps Score. I hope that if you didn't, and you're interested, you might take a look at it, because in that book, he talks about a very long career of looking at resilience and ways to build it. He's a professor emeritus in the Department of Psychiatry at, I want to say Harvard. I believe that's correct. I know he's in the Boston area. And he has been looking at ways to cultivate internal resilience. And one of those ways is E.M.D.R, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what he has found is that eye movements can cement good memories that replace bad memories in the face of PTSD, for example. And it's a method that therapists are now using to replace old, quote, old traumas with new, more pleasant material. Another resource that I'd like to share with you is one that is contained now in a series of research papers by Dr. Lucy Hone. She is a New Zealander who got her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And she is a New Zealander by birth and has now returned to New Zealand. And she did her doctoral work with a name I hope you now find familiar, Martin Seligman, at the University of Pennsylvania. And she studied resilience with he and his colleagues. She went back to New Zealand right after the earthquake. You may recall, it's now been, 5 or 6 years ago? I apologize for the loud noise that I'm sure you all just picked up. One of the challenges in this pandemic has been to our essential workers who pick up the garbage here in Pittsfield, and that was the garbage truck. And I made an executive decision not to get up and leave you to close the window when the garbage truck rolled up. They're usually pretty quick, but because I was so conscious of it today, I think it took them a long time, and we only had one garbage can. Back to Dr. Hone. As I said, she got her advanced degree studying resilience, and then she learned at a very personal level that suffering is a part of life. And of course, we've talked about that before. And most of us kind of, certainly in this country, think that we might be entitled to a perfect life. But as the Buddhists have told us for centuries, suffering is a very real part of life. And as I said, she knew that in an abstract way, but then her daughter, Abby, you see her daughter pictured here as a youngster, lost her life in a tragic accident. She was in a car with a friend, and a friend's mother was driving, and another car ran a red light and hit them, and all three of the people in that car were killed instantly. So one of her messages is to keep in mind, not in the front of your mind, for goodness sake, but kind of in the back of your mind, that suffering is a part of life. And when you're challenged by something that's painful, then choose where you are directing your attention. And we've talked about focus before, but one of her takeaways from her personal experience was that we have a choice about where we direct our attention, and that one of the things that resilient people do is to tune into the good things rather than tuning in to the bad. And one of the ways to do that, and psychologists call this benefit finding, is that you focus not on what you've lost, but on what you still have. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just suggesting it's helpful. And then finally, you can take control, according to Dr. Hung, by asking yourself, what am I doing that is helping me today or harming me today? When you ask yourself that question as you face your challenge, it gives you a sense of control. And that sense of control is really important in dealing with the challenge in a resilient way. I also want to share with you a little bit from Stephen Southwick, who is a professor emeritus of psychiatry at Yale, who has written a book entitled Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. And Southwick suggests that our individual resilience is dictated by a number of factors, and they include, and we've talked about these things before, genetics, and research has shown us that that's a very small part of what comprises resilience. Much more important is our personal history, the environment, and by that, the social as well as the physical environment, and the situational context in which the challenge occurs. Personal history is really important because, according to Stephen Southwick's research, the quality of our close personal relationships is pivotal in terms of building resilience. And those relationships are perhaps relationships with parents, but it need not be parental. It may possibly be primary caretakers or those who care, who remember the resilient children that M.E.D.R studied in Kauai. Those were the kids who, when they couldn't get what they needed at home, found it outside their homes. So here are the characteristics of resilient people, according to Southwick. Resilient people have positive, realistic outlooks. So they're not delusional and say, well, everything's wonderful in a kind of Pollyanna-ish way. They have a moral compass. They believe in something greater than themselves. This may not be religiosity. Remember when we talked about getting outside and finding a sense of our place in the universe by looking up into tall trees? That can be a belief in something greater than yourself. But of course, so can your religious faith. Resilient people are altruistic. They think about others. Resilient people accept what they cannot change and focus on what they can. And we've just talked about focusing on what you're doing to help yourself today instead of what you're doing to make your situation worse. You can control that. You may have to fight intrusive thoughts, but you still have choice. Resilient people have a sense of mission, of meaning, of purpose. And resilient people have a social support system. But on the flip side, resilient people often provide support to others. And of course, as we've talked about, that's part of finding meaning. It's also altruistic. We can learn to be resilient by taking meaningful action. I'm underscoring again the reality that one of the benefits we as human beings have is the cognitive ability, at least most of us, to make meaningful choices. And so another form of asking the question Lucy Hone suggested, what is something I can do today, even something small, to remind myself that I'm not helpless? And of course, it's tremendously important to connect to others. Very few resilient people go it alone. In fact, very few resilient people even try to do it by themselves. Quick review. We talked about the model that Jeanette Ikovics and I proposed. 2.5 decades ago, for understanding the possible outcomes in the face of adversity. Now, as we talked about in the very first class, there are 4 possibilities. One, of course, is that you just don't survive. And we didn't even put that in our graphic representation, but that would be death. And as you know, a lot of people whose lives are suddenly changed because they're incapacitated by accident, think immediately following the event, when you have that decrement down to the bottom of the graph, that death, not surviving, is the preferable alternative. I remember years ago reading about, I'm forgetting, Christopher played Superman. Some of you may remember when he was on stage in Williamstown a very long time ago. Christopher Reeves had a tragic accident on horseback. And he was jumping. He fell forward over the horse's shoulder. He was wearing a helmet, but the force of the fall, and he fell literally onto his head, left him paralyzed from the neck down. And when he regained consciousness and was told in the hospital what had happened and what his situation was, his first response was, "I don't want to live this way, pull the plug." But this is, I remember this from reading, I believe it was an autobiography. It may have been, however, something that his wife, Dana, wrote. And she tapped his head, which was the only place, remember, he was paralyzed from the neck up, was the only place that he had feeling. And she said, "The Christopher that I love is here," meaning the Christopher that I love is the cognitive Christopher who can talk with me and share both joy and sorrow with me. And out of that came a renewed will to go on. But it's not unusual for someone confronted with a catastrophic challenge for their first response to be just, "Let me go." Survival is the second possibility faced with a challenge, and that's just hanging on. Resilience is a return to where you were before the challenge occurred. And thriving, of course, is growing beyond where you were before you were challenged. And that challenge provides an opportunity for change because it forces us to confront our personal priorities. It forces us to re-examine our sense of ourselves. It forces us to pause and take stock. And that is exactly what this pandemic has forced us to do. And there's no question about the fact that it has been a challenge. The thing that makes it a little unusual is that it's been a common challenge. It hasn't, it certainly affected each of us in different ways at a personal level. But as we've heard over and over again since when? Early January, at least, we're all in this together. So we faced a common challenge, plus a series of individual challenges depending on our particular circumstances. My son is an adult, so I haven't had to face the challenge of homeschooling. And I don't have any grandchildren to homeschool. Many of you have done one or the other, or maybe even both. I'm retired, so I'm not working anymore. So I haven't had to face the challenge of learning how to work remotely. Numbers of you have faced that challenge. Although I must say I found it a challenge to learn how to teach remotely over Zoom, especially in the webinar format, which is the one we're in right now, because I cannot see any of you. And so I feel as if I'm speaking into a great dark void. And for somebody who spent 4.5 decades speaking to rooms full of undergraduate and graduate students and relying on their energy, their nonverbal language for feedback, their looks of confusion to make me back up and redefine, not being able to see you has challenged me. But out of these challenges have come some pretty phenomenal creative solutions to the current situation that we might not have gotten to without this challenge. So I'm going to talk for a minute about the arts. Walter Enriquez recently wrote that art, and he was referring to art that he was doing, helps us recapture the past and relive positive experiences to get through pain and sadness. Now, Enriquez had never been artistic. He'd never tried art until he was presented during this pandemic with an opportunity to do a Zoom class, an opportunity that was provided by the Queen's Museum in New York City to the community. He's an older man. He was lonely. He was frightened. And suddenly he had a chance to produce art. Now, we've known for a long time, we being psychologists, that art therapy can improve mood and it can reduce pain. And now museums are beginning to create programs to do just that. Did you know that art therapy programs are often paid for by insurance companies? Art therapy programs can be really useful for people who resist traditional kinds of therapy, talk therapy, for example, or even chemical interventions. But now museums are coming forward and thinking about ways to create programs to use art history to reflect on shared experiences of isolation and trauma. And so the Metropolitan Museum of Art is going to be mounting exhibits reflective of historical trauma with trigger warnings in the signage for visitors who might be distressed by looking at scenes, even scenes painted by artists that remind them of difficult times. But they're also thinking about doing the opposite, which is to mount exhibits that are a compilation of canvases that provide a sense of tranquility. Beautiful landscapes, for example. Museums have always been places of wonderment and beauty and awe. But now museums are starting to consider how they might become places of care. It took a pandemic to get them to pivot, to think about that possibility. And that's kind of exciting. The Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art in New York City is filled with treasures from Southeast Asia. And I think I mentioned perhaps in another class that I've spent quite a lot of time in Southeast Asia and really did learn to not only do Vipassana meditation in Nepal, but also to appreciate the art of Southeast Asia. And the Rubin Museum, which is in Manhattan, has many, many treasures of both Hindu and Buddhist art. And if you go online, you will find them inviting you to view some of that art and to reflect with them. In fact, I went online to download this particular graphic, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago. And one of the things they were offering online, and those of you who are inclined might be interested in this, they had a short video and they invited you to do origami with an origami master who showed in a YouTube presentation how to use origami to make a lotus flower. And I'd never thought about that before, so I couldn't resist watching. And it was a lovely exercise. It was with a very attractive outcome. And there's something calming about folding paper and making a beautiful symbol of wisdom, because that's what the lotus is, a symbol of wisdom. And they have lots of other activities as well. The Metropolitan Museum, when it reopens, is thinking about mounting an exhibit that depicts the art of resilience such as Faith Ringgold, who's pictured here, in front of her well-known street story quilt. Very new ways for museums to think about curating their treasures. Saturday night, some of you out there may be fans of Jacob's Pillow. There was a program live streamed from Jacob's Pillow with Wendy Whalen and her colleague, whose name I know as well as my own and can't think of it. AIM is the name of his dance company. I'll think of it and come back and tell you. That live streamed many short and extraordinarily beautiful pieces, dance pieces that had been commissioned for this particular live stream program. Barrington Stage, right here in Pittsfield, has gotten creative. We had a tour recently online of Mary Jo Rupp's home. Sometime later this summer, they are going to bring in an orchestra to play in an outdoor venue the beloved musical pieces from the musical that we won't see this summer, but hopefully will next, South Pacific. They're thinking outside the box. And of course, so is the Clark Museum of Art in Williamstown. I've forgotten the year that the Clark Museum opened, but given that I grew up in Pittsfield and my father, who was an architect, was also quite very actually, not quite artistically inclined, he took the family to the Clark when it first opened. It was, I'm thinking mid-50s, which would have made me, what, 10-ish? Somewhere in there. And I'd never seen a building like that before. And I had a very creative mind. And I remember going up those steps. The parking lot is now in back, but things have changed a bit across the decades. And being absolutely overwhelmed by this magnificent marble structure and thinking, someday I think I want to live here. Well, I go fairly often, but I think living in the Clark is a little beyond my means. I want to turn now, having emphasized the creativity that we have seen among people in the arts, both here in the Berkshires and beyond, to some lessons to remember as the lockdown ends. And it's ending, as we know, more slowly than some would have liked, more rapidly than others who are concerned think is prudent, but it is ending. We've been through it together apart, so what are the takeaways? Well, one takeaway is that being with others is the key to happiness. And that doesn't mean being with others face to face, although that's a good way to do it. But it underscores our human need for connection. And Zoom, thinking outside the box, has provided us with a way to be together when, for health reasons, it's not safe for us to be physically together. And as things start to open up in terms of reflecting on positive things, let's try to remember our newfound appreciation for being together in person. You know, we adapt so quickly to what is before us, and that's both a plus and a minus. And how often have we heard, oh, Americans have such short memories? Well, I'm just reminding us to remember. Another takeaway, this pandemic allows us, or at least has the potential to allow us to deepen our sense of common humanity and build a kinder, more connected society. I really hope we seize the moment and make that a priority. And don't forget what it was like not to be able to see the people you wanted to see when you wanted to see them. Use this pause as a signal to make more time in your life to get together with the people you care about. A third takeaway is to focus attention on others. We tend to forget. We get so caught up in the immediacy of I must do the next chore. I must finish the project. I must finish my homework, that we forget. And as I said in the first class, when I suggested to you that you keep a gratitude journal, I'd love to know how many of you actually took that advice and did it. And if you did, even if you didn't do it right in it every single day, go back and take the authentic happiness inventory again, the one I suggested you take the first week, and see if writing in your gratitude journal made a difference in your score. Gratitude matters. Winton knows. We're now going to shift and take a deeper dive into silver linings. Some of these things are things that have come out of our recent experience with the pandemic, and others are opportunities that could become realities moving forward if we choose to make them real. Remember when you learned as a kid that silver linings surround every cloud? I remember my father telling me that, look for the silver lining. And I would look up at the sky and see, and sometimes if the clouds were very dark, I insisted that there weren't any silver linings. And he would point again and again, and finally I would say, oh, all right, yeah, I see it. But it was very tiny, and I considered it not very significant. Whoops, excuse me. So what does it take to see the benefits, or as psychologists call it, benefit finding, to engage in benefit finding? Well, it involves the cognitive reframe. Cognitive just refers to thinking. It involves learning how to look at a situation in new ways. And there are two primary levels in which we can do that. There are personal benefits, and I bet you have discovered many of them in the last 3.5 months. There are books, and there are blogs. People are blogging like never before in terms of numbers. And there are so many books available now online, many, many of them at no charge, and others at a very modest charge. And of course, libraries have been wonderful about providing ebooks to people who belong. A lot of people, you may be one of them, have rediscovered talents that either you'd forgotten about because it was something you enjoyed when you were in grammar school and had then put aside as your life got increasingly busy, and hadn't thought about again until suddenly the pandemic provided you with a lot of time on your hands that you needed to fill. Or like the man I described earlier, maybe it wasn't a rediscovery, maybe it was a discovery. He had never done anything with drawing and colored pencils, etc. before. And yet, when the Queen's Museum offered him the option of getting involved in an online class, he found it incredibly gratifying. Maybe you picked up an instrument. You might have had to go up in the attic to retrieve it that you played as a youth. Several times, I know I thought to myself, because I had more time than usual, gosh, I wish I hadn't gotten rid of my violin. Well, I stopped taking violin lessons in Pittsfield when I was in 7th grade. But I love the sound of the violin. And in the back of my mind, I always thought, someday, perhaps. Well, you got to have a violin to pick up the violin again. And I finally passed it on to somebody else who wanted to take lessons. So I didn't have that option. But I know a young mother who has been engaging her 3-year-old with singing lessons online. There's so much out there if we look. Reconnecting. We've had more time. If you're like me, you've thought about some folks you hadn't been in contact with for a very long time. And maybe you even reached out and wrote them a note, gave them a phone call, sent them an email. That's important. And uplifting. Exercise. We all know it's important. We often put it aside because our lives pre-pandemic have been so busy that we just felt we didn't have time to go to the gym today, and then tomorrow comes and we don't have time then, etc. But with some extra time, we've run out of excuses for at least some exercise. And there are a lot of free apps available. You can do yoga. My sister-in-law, who's into Zumba, does a Zumba class online every day. When the Y opens again in Pittsfield, I'll go back to water aerobics classes. But in the meantime, I've been using a DVD that I've had for probably at least 10 years to stretch. And Winton, the poodle, whose picture you've seen several times in this class, has gotten into stretching with us. It's pretty funny. Speaking of dogs, that has been another silver lining of the pandemic. Did you know that in California, in Los Angeles and the San Diego area, I believe it's San Diego, I know it's Los Angeles, there has been a 200% spike in applications to adopt pets, and a 70% increase in people wanting to foster pets. We have a very good friend who lives right outside of the District of Columbia, just over the line in Silver Spring, Maryland, who called us at the beginning of this pandemic and said, oh, I've made a decision. I think I'm going to get a dog. He has some health issues, so he needed a fairly small dog because he knew the dog would stimulate him to get out and walk a bit. But because of his health issues, it was important that it not be a big dog who could yank him off his feet. And he wanted to adopt, and he just plain couldn't find an animal at the time he was looking. Things are opening up. Hopefully, the availability of animals needing homes will increase again. And I'm going to stay on him by not nagging him, but asking him, so have you had any luck? Lots of personal benefits. And societal benefits as well. This is a moment, one that perhaps we would not have chosen voluntarily, but a moment forced upon us during which we can, if we choose, affect meaningful change. Change in the way we do things, change in our communities. We're seeing calls for those changes all around us. It's up to us to take meaningful action in order to make those changes a reality. There's been a lot of new learning. A lot of learning about how to use technology. It hasn't always been smooth sailing, as I'm sure you've noticed. Sometimes it seems as though we've overloaded the capability of the internet. Things freeze. We have trouble with audio, etc. But I would suspect that the technology available to us using Zoom and other such platforms is going to result in our never going back to the now old-fashioned conference call. Less travel. Actually, almost no travel. That's had a real impact on fossil fuel consumption. More remote work has opened up so many new possibilities and opportunities. And the pandemic spikes in the meatpacking industry has also resulted in a lesser availability of meat, and one consequence, less methane gas being released into the environment. A lot of these things are things that people talked about as being great future possibilities. And we've now been forced to experience them in real time. One of the things that we've learned in the last 3.5 months is that we, humans, are not helpless in the face of pollution. If we want to, we can commit to making change. This is Beijing. On your right is Beijing pre-pandemic, where the pollution is very thick, so thick that it looks like the entire city is in a cloud. And on your left, a more recent shot from the same position, where you can actually see the skyscrapers in the distance. This shot was taken within the last few months. In 1990, I was in Chengdu, China, and the pollution in Chengdu in 1990 was extraordinary. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we walked out of our hotel in downtown Chengdu in order to take a trip to the Panda Research Center, Yeah, I really like animals, and I was in China and I wanted to see the pandas at the Panda Research Center. And the pollution at 9 in the morning on a sunny day, we could not see the sun, was so extraordinary that we could not see across the street. Now, I admit it was 6 lanes, but you couldn't see from one side or over to the other because of industrial pollution. Wasn't the panda's fault. And in fact, the research center was quite a ways out of the city. They really are cute. That is a recent picture of the Himalayas without pollution. I've been to Nepal many times. I love the Himalayas. I find those mountains breathtaking. I've never been able to see those mountains with that kind of clarity. And I'm jealous. But it proves what a significant change can occur in a very short time. If any of you have been to Venice, you probably have not seen water that clear. Again, a very recent picture of one of the canals. If you had asked me pre-pandemic if this kind of change in the environment would have been possible in 3.5 or 4 months, I would have told you absolutely not. Mother Earth is surprisingly resilient, isn't she? So are we. Another consequence of the pandemic has been the necessity / opportunity to rethink work. We have had now quite an extraordinary number of people working from home. Pre-pandemic, the estimates of remote workers nationally was about 10%. Last week, I read one estimate that it had jumped to 67%. Again, extraordinary in such a short period of time. And we've already talked about the fact that we've learned to communicate virtually, some of us reluctantly, but now that we know how, we're not going to go back, or at least I suspect most of us will not. Oh, sorry about that. He's learned to communicate through technology as well. And of course, conferencing through Zoom. So many changes and so many creative solutions. Leadership and culture can make or break a business. We all know that. But right now, with so many businesses in such economic difficulty, that has never been more clear. And I think it's important as we begin to move out of this period of enforced isolation, hopefully for the long term, although that's not entirely clear, we'll see, it's really important to build a solid foundation for business. And that typically means building a foundation that has a leadership and a culture based on trust, especially during a period with so many people working remotely. In the very beginning of the pandemic, as increasing numbers of workers went to remote working, the leadership of businesses that did it most effectively were those that were willing to trust their employees. And the ones that were least effective were those that did not trust and relied on various forms of technological micromanagement. It's bad enough to have a boss looking over your shoulder, but to have a boss watching your every move using technology, that's got to be frustrating at best and devastating at worst. So trust is important. And as we have begun to understand the benefits of trust in the business world, we should be now thinking about how to capitalize on what we have learned. Trust is really powerful. Employees who feel trusted have, and this is based on recent research, more energy at work, or at least they report to be more energized while they're working. They're more engaged in their work tasks. And that's despite possible interruptions from others with whom they share their homes. Reduction in stress levels that are clearly associated with the work that they're doing. Now, we've talked about other sources of stress during the pandemic. Less likelihood of feeling burned out, and a higher sense of life satisfaction overall. Remote workers say they feel more trusted by their employers. And their employers report a spike in productivity among remote workers. One survey found a 15% spike in productivity among workers who were working at remote sites, and 82% of remote workers reporting that they felt more trusted as a consequence of being allowed to work remotely without 24/7 surveillance. So just quickly, a couple of pluses. Oh, Megan, did we have any? No, I don't. Did we have anything in chat? Oh, we have 7.
Oh, we had a couple of comments. Lee Easter says he's discovered autistic artists. The one he knows best is Candy Waters, and she might have more info on her Facebook page. There's also an artist out of Bennington who works with researchers at Williams College. And Brian Harrison asked, how does eye movement influence resilience? And there's some nice comments about your class here.
Oh, nice. Well, the eye movements, if you close your eyes and move your eye, it's a whole technique that Van der Kolk has discovered, that you can think of pleasant things. And it turns out that with your eyes closed, the motion of your eyes from one side to the other, but you're not looking at anything, you're just bringing up memories of things that are pleasant, can kind of, so it seems like a combination of the motion of the eyes while reflecting on pleasant scenes, if you will, that are real to you, not fantasies, can replace traumatic scenes for people with PTSD. So that's basically his, and you can't do it in 5 minutes either. And this is a more longer term kind of treatment.
And Ben Green asks, he says E.M.D.R was originally offered only by licensed therapists. Is it available as self-help now?
I don't believe so, no. Although certainly you can read the, read the book that I showed you. What is it? The Body Keeps Score, I think. And learn more about the technique, but no, it's not I don't think it's something you should try at home. I don't think it would hurt you, perhaps, but I think that, like many things, you need the guidance of someone who has been schooled in it, in the technique. Just in the same way, it's probably not a good thing to try to hypnotize your neighbor.
Depending. No, sorry, I'm just kidding. And Linda Friedman writes, do you have any suggestions for volunteering while working at home?
Oh, golly, I do, but I would have to reflect on that for a few minutes. I'm doing a fair amount of remote volunteering myself, mostly making phone calls to, on behalf of organizations, to connect with other volunteers. So, for example, I just finished a batch of phone calls for Barrington Stage, calling volunteers from, who are on their volunteer list. They're about, close to 400, I imagine. I did not call 400 people. Just saying, we're checking on our volunteer family. I know Jacob's Pillow is using folks to keep the connections. I'm sure probably Berkshire Theater Group. So if you're involved with any of the arts organizations, if you want to send Megan that query, or maybe you can save the chat and give me your email address, I can make a list for you.
And OLLI also welcomes volunteers,
Yes.
both to do check-in calls to OLLI members, but also we have curriculum committees where you can help develop classes, you can teach classes as volunteers, you can organize shared interest groups, and a lot of other things. And all of the activities that OLLI offers contributes to our community by providing the opportunity for people to come together, to learn together, and to engage, and that has a significant health and quality of life benefits.
Absolutely. We know that, don't we now? All of us.
So, and Ben Green has another question. When do past traumas need to be explored therapeutically rather than avoided and dealt with by distractions?
Nobody is suggesting it's a distractor, but rather it helps with the repetition of the intrusion. And so there's a difference. It's funny, we don't lend a lot of credence anymore. By we, I mean psychologists to Freud. But many of you who took Psychology 101 may remember Freud's comments about the return of the neurosis kind of knocking at the door in a way that is irritate, it keeps the same thing coming up again and again. The eye movement in the face of PTSD is not distracting people from the reality of the trauma, but rather giving them a tool so that it doesn't intrude repetitively. That's the difference.
Great. Thank you, Ginny. Did you have some more?
I do.
I will step off and
thanks.
Continue.
So we've talked about the benefits of working remotely. We've talked about the benefits of connecting via various interactive platforms. And we've all been practicing. And one of the things that's become clear from this practice in both business and learning situations is underscoring the value of clear communications. We knew about frequent interaction with others, but it's given us a way, maybe not our preferred way, but a way to accomplish those interactions. And for many, it has promoted a kind of agility and an openness and an empathy and courage to deal with disruption. So if you're thinking about business applications, the core of existence as a business is having a mission and purpose. And this pause has been a pause for some to reflect and in many cases pivot moving forward. It's emphasized for us, all of us, I think, that we have the skills to survive, but we also have the capabilities to thrive. My guess is that going forward, workplace learning and probably academic learning is never going to be the same. When we talked about thriving in the first class, we talked about thriving as requiring the mobilization of individual resources and social resources. And we need to pay attention to both types of resource. Going forward from today, instability continues to be with us, but the opportunity for experimentation, I believe there should be an A in forward, is with us as well. we've had the chance to slow down and to connect in new ways. We've been able to pause and think about who we are. And I hope reflect not only on who we are, but who our best selves can be. And those best selves moving forward are connector selves. We've had a chance to engage in a global reset for humanity. I don't know if we're going to take it, but the opportunity is there. One planet, one home, one community. Because we've all faced a common challenge, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And I hope that this pandemic does remind us of our common humanity and our relatively precarious place in the Earth's grand experiment. We've been reminded, I think, that we can readjust our personal habits, like shaking hands, like exposing our noses and mouths, and that we can alter our institutional arrangements by working remotely, for example. And so we need to look for new models. And one way of doing that is to step back and look for models that have worked on small scales that haven't gotten a lot of focused attention that might be applied on a much grander scale. I can't, in good conscience, leave you without reminding you that this pandemic is not over. I know we wish it were. I know that there are many who are saying it's fine. The statistics released this morning belie that position. There are lots of alternatives to doing things the way we used to do them. Alternatives to handshakes and hugs, highbrows, the all good nod, the East Coast wave, etc. We're very adaptable, and we need to adapt, but we also must stay mindful of the need to not only protect ourselves, but perhaps more importantly, to protect others. I've tried to give you a variety of tools to help you be resilient. These tools aren't just tools to be used during lockdown. You really can use them anytime, every time, all the time. Please do. I love this image. You all know what it is. It's a spider web. It's made of silk. produced by spiders, and spider web silk is stronger than steel. It is amazingly flexible as it moves in the wind, but when it's hit by an external force or pressure, it becomes absolutely rigid. That's how they catch their food. So think about it as you think about what resilience means at the human level. Strong, adaptable, flexible, etc. And remember that there's a step beyond resilience, and that step is thriving. Thriving requires a shift in response to challenge. It requires growth beyond where you were before the challenge occurred. And it's important, to, of course, to remember that one person's challenge is not another. We can use this pandemic as the impetus to marshal our individual creativity, our social connections, in ways that make it possible for us to thrive. I hope we take advantage of this opportunity. Talk to your friends and neighbors about how they think they could make that kind of a contribution. Think about it yourself and share it, please, with others. I'm providing the resources that I gave you last week again. I will also send Megan a list of places that you might volunteer to make a contribution. And I'll tell you, I can put such a list in these slides so they can go up when the link is shared. Be well. Stay safe. Together, we can thrive. Thank you so much.